A Woman of Pleasure by Kiyoko Murata is incredible. This is an impeccable piece of Japanese fiction in translation. This was translated into English by Juliet Winters Carpenter, and thank you so much to Footnote for sending me this review copy. I am sure that this is going to end up on my Books in Translation of 2024 list when we reach the end of this year. I am confident in saying that right now, so let's talk about why. What's interesting first of all is that this is the first Kiyoko Murata book that we've had translated into English. As far as I can tell, she is a very, very famous and well-awarded Japanese author. She's won over 10 literary awards, she's been writing for decades, and now we're just getting her books in English. It feels like a lot of wasted time, but I'm just thrilled to be reading her now, and also really, really happy that Juliet Winters Carpenter has done the translation, because she is one of the greats of Japanese to English literary translation. Now, A Woman of Pleasure is set in 1903, during the Meiji Restoration and after the fall of the Tokugawa shogunate. Our protagonist is a young girl, and she is a girl, I need to make that clear. Her name is Aoi Ichi. She is from a small island in the south of Japan, with a dialect so thick that nobody else can understand her. She cannot read or write. She's from a poor fishing village, a poor family, but that family have sold her into sex work. When the novel begins, she is 15 years old, and she is a human being who has been purchased by a brothel. It is not a happy situation, and yet this is a curiously happy book. It's very hopeful for a start. It's a book about progress, but I guess what makes it feel like a happy story in a way is Ichi herself. She is sweetly naive, she is very hopeful, and she is propped up and supported by the people around her. There is an argument to be made that this is kind of a found family story. The people that Ichi meets, and who we meet by extension, are really, really lovely and fascinating women. When she arrives at this brothel in Kumamoto, she is taken under the wing of Shinonome. Shinonome is the highest ranking courtesan of this brothel. Those high ranking courtesans are known as oiran, and Ichi is now her protege. She will look after her, she will train her. And when I talk about training, nothing is omitted here. This is a very vicious and uncensored book. Every single detail of the life of a sex worker at this time is covered in this book. There are vivid experiences that are painted, and human biology is explored in detail as well. Nothing is skirted around, but nothing feels awkward either. Just kind of matter of fact. A Woman of Pleasure is undeniably a book that will make you feel righteous anger. It'll make you feel very sad. It's a book of desperation and frustration. It's certainly a feminist book, but what's so curious and exciting about the book is its examination of the psychology of what's going on. The minds of these women, how they cope, how they support each other, how they find ways to survive and be better. For example, Ichi goes to a special school where she is trained in various arts and crafts. She learns to read and to write. The school is kind of in charge of making her a more well-rounded adult person. And one thing that Ichi is really, really good at, although it doesn't really matter and she doesn't care, is writing. She's very good at expressing herself. All the way through the book, we get small diary entries from Ichi, which read like poetry. These are diary entries in verse, and they are gorgeous. Her perspective on life, on her situation, on her family, on her homeland, this island that she so desperately wants to return to, it is all so poetic, so concise, and yet dreamlike almost. It's really incredible writing, and the way that these bits are translated is so beautiful. And she's not intending to write gorgeous poetry. It's like she just is gorgeous poetry. It just comes out of her. She's barely learned to read and write. She doesn't know many characters, and that is presented through poor spelling in the English translation, and yet she makes do with what she knows, with what she understands, and she creates beautiful poetry almost by accident. It really endears you to her as a character. But A Woman of Pleasure is also not a plot-propelled novel. It is very much about the characters and their day-to-day lives. The blurb actually talks about how this is building up to a strike. Workers in different industries all around Japan at this time were striking. And in 1904, there really was a big sex workers' strike across all of Japan. And we're building up to that thing. The blurb gives that away, but it actually only happens in the final 2 chapters of the book. It almost comes out of nowhere, actually, because for the first 95% of this book, you're just following this life. And we're not only seeing things through Ichi's eyes, but also the other women that she meets. Her teacher, her mentor, and an older courtesan who ends up getting pregnant. And we watch what happens to her when she's in that situation. It is all so eye-opening. And I keep coming back to the fact that this will make you angry and frustrated at men and at patriarchy. The fact that these women have been bought and sold and are referred to as cattle. They are livestock to be treated however men wish to treat them, and exchanging money for the privilege of doing that. It makes your blood boil. And yet, because it's from the perspective of this kind of naive girl who's been thrown into this awful life, there is a sense of light and colour and hope to this story because of Ichi herself. It's really, really interesting. There's a wonderful conversation early on in the book between different characters talking about how being a courtesan is better than being a wife and mother. A wife and mother serves her family, while a courtesan has more freedom, arguably, although she has been bought and sold, therefore she's kind of legal property. A woman is a slave to her home, to her family, and she's very much chained to it. But what none of these women realize while I was reading it is that neither of these are good things, neither of these are freedoms, and it is all these women have. Which kind of slavery would you prefer? And they push forward through their lives, having these kind of philosophical arguments based on their options, based on what they have. They do not have actual real freedom, they do not have autonomy, and yet they argue and they debate and they talk about their lot. Until, as we know, they will start to find ways to free themselves, to own themselves, to find autonomy. And when we're building up to these strikes, there is a massive tonal shift, although I don't want to talk about that because even though this isn't really a book you can spoil, and the ending is spoiled by the blurb, I still want you to have the emotional satisfaction of getting there in the second half of the story. As I'm stood here talking about this, I'm finding that A Woman of Pleasure is a difficult book to review. Structurally, we follow Ichi, but we also move between different characters. It's all written in a very matter-of-fact way, nothing is shied away from, and it's certainly a feminist novel that will make you angry. You will feel pain on behalf of these women. You will desperately want to free them. You will read on as Ichi pines for her home, the home that sold her. This island with its sea turtles and its fishing and its sandy beaches, the way she romanticizes it, but she's not really doing that intentionally. She's such a sweet, naive thing. You'll feel so much, and yet hope remains. Positivity remains in this story. It is not a doom and gloom narrative, despite what it's depicting and despite the situations of its protagonists. You still feel good for these women. You feel hopeful, you feel positive that things will be good, that things are good now given their circumstance because of how they behave, because of how they treat each other, because of how they bond with each other. Ichi loves these women, and that love overrides what she is forced to do, what she's been sold to do. The love, the friendship, it is also intense, and the hope overrides everything else. I'm so surprised by the power of this book and the emotional range it has, and the emotional direction that it takes, and that it pushes you towards as a reader. I didn't know I was going to feel the feelings that I felt as I read this. Kiyoko Murata has done something really, really special here, quite courageous, to write such a visceral and, as I said, very uncensored story about a girl growing up into womanhood earlier than she should have to because she was sold as a courtesan. There's so much tragedy there, but it's not tragic, not all of the time. And it's also an historical lesson about this time period, about the politics, about the men, about the bureaucracy, about the legal rights of women most of all. There's so much more I could go into, but I don't want to keep waffling. I just need you to know that so far in 2024, A Woman of Pleasure is one of the best books we have this year, and you need to read it. Incredibly well translated, a fascinating piece of Japanese history, and a book with such an incredible emotional range. What a fascinating thing. Really, really amazing stuff. Please, please check out A Woman of Pleasure as soon as you can. It is remarkable. And subscribe for books.